How you guys doing today? It's a Sunday afternoon. Today I want to talk to you about Charles Mingus's Pithecanthropus erectus. It's kind of an early tour de force for the edges of the sounds of jazz, and it really predates most of its contemporaries in these out sounds. And much like Black Saint and Cinderlady 10 years later, there's moments of great melancholic bliss. There's also moments of intense avant garde danger, edge. And he kind of wanders us in between the two places. The There's a great deal of dissonance and edgy chords created by the arrangements that create a very interesting soup. And one thing that's important to remember is comes out in 1956. And Jimmy Joffrey is the only other guy that comes to mind on the West Coast that was kind of doing stuff that had these really out angles and spaces and uh, much bigger arrangements too than, like, say, what a Monk was doing just with him and his trios and some of the work he did at Prestige and Blue Note. This is a full ensemble of dissonant Ellington and big group here. It's a big group. There's lots of honking, lots of cacophony, uh, and yet it's always kind of resolved back into a blues riff that's kind of soothing. Uh, the membership of this record includes Jackie McLean on the alto sax, J.R. Montrose on the tenor sax, and J.R. has that one great record at Blue Note and had a kind of a rather anonymous career for a great player and chose to stay kind of under the surface playing locally and playing live. Mal Waldron's on the piano, Willie Jones is on the drums, Tom Dowd is producing this. McLean appears courtesy of Prestige, where, of course, he's under contract. Foggy Day is also a fantastic track on here. Love Chant is beautiful. But I'm going to read a few of the liner notes here. This composition is actually a jazz tone poem because it depicts musically my conception of the modern counterpart of the first man to stand erect. How proud he was, considering himself the first to ascend from all fours, pounding his chest and preaching his superiority over the manimal still in prone position. Overcome with self-esteem, he goes out to rule the world, if not the universe. But both his own failure to realize the inenviable emancipation of those he sought to enslave, and his greed in attempting to stand on a false security, deny him not only the right of ever being a man, but finally destroy him completely. Basically, the composition can be divided into four movements: evolution, superiority complex, decline, and destruction. And so it's a fairly involved and engaged arrangement that kind of demands something of the listener. It's not like a casual listen. And you can put it on in that context. And it surprisingly has some very, like I said, accessible moments. There's points where it's the Pink Panther and its coolness. It's just swanky and slathered with interesting sounds. But then it always kind of descends, just like Black Saint and Sinner Lady does, into these intense avenues of desperation. And again, there's a theme to it. You can really feel, here comes more of that intensity. It's a piece ahead of its time in a lot of ways. And Mingus does some fine records after this Mingus album, Mingus. The record at the piano is fantastic. I don't care for his work on Candid so much. A lot of it's kind of live and really raw. But again, Mingus is a fairly forward-thinking jazz man. And while he's not the kind of personality you want to spend much time with, he certainly was one of the more creative minds of the late 50s and early 60s. And he's wedged solidly in between Ellington and Monk. Like he's right there in terms of his grand compositional ideas, his big undertakings with larger ensembles, the degree to which he can bring cacophony and dissonance into the mix without it ever losing the broth that makes it stirrable. It never becomes too unlistenable. And it always kind of gets you back to a place of, oh, I can breathe here, which is kind of nice. But again, it's a tribute to Atlantic Records because Atlantic's always kind of considered as a little sister in the jazz canon, which is kind of a mistake. A lot of the most innovative records on jazz in the mid '50s and the late '50s are on Atlantic, and Atlantic does focus on its R&B a little bit more, and its blues a little bit more. But the jazz series, the 1200 series on Atlantic, is littered with incredible great titles, and a couple of the greatest titles in the jazz canon. Uh, they certainly deserve more recognition, and Atlantic deserves more credit than they're given. And when you think of some of the giant Coltrane records on Atlantic, the Ornette Coleman records that appear on Atlantic, the Mingus stuff that is happening there, and then some of the stuff like Milt Jackson, who's playing the blues. It's just a great mix of the cutting edge in jazz and the middle of the road in jazz, the R&B tinge side of jazz. It's always well packaged and put together. It's the Erdogan brothers do a great job. And a lot of labels, Blue Note wouldn't have touched this in 1956. Don't think for a second that Alford and Frank were like, oh, that's exactly what we're looking for. Weinstock wouldn't have gone near this in 56. All those labels that we talk about that are such great jazz institutions, it's Atlantic that's often taken the greatest chances and recording some of the most cutting edge and inventive stuff, innovative stuff. And I think they really get a raw deal in terms of how much praise we eschew onto the jazz labels of the 50s and the 60s. The Atlantic discography, I have about almost 400 of them in the 1200 sequence. And Rashawn Roland Kirk comes along later. Just David Newman, some great players. And certainly once the 60s come along, the R&B side of jazz becomes more the forefront. But when they're in that late 50s, man, there's some stuff that will just shake your timbers. They're also recording the Julius Watkins and Charlie Rouse group called the Jazz Modes. They do a couple recordings here after their stuff at the Dawn label. Those are very forward-thinking, modern, compositionally driven. And people kind of forget that even the modern jazz quartet was a very innovative thing. We kind of diminish it, I think, today and think it's kind of too easy listening, but that wasn't really John Lewis's approach. He was trying to make jazz graft into the European tradition to make it something you could kind of compose and arrange on paper, to add elements of modern compositional European tonality and sound into that third stream innovative thing that he was doing. The MJQ comes from a very much a blues and straightforward post-bop sound when they're at Savoy. But when they move into Atlantic, John Lewis is really given the freedom by the powers that be at Atlantic to really push his envelopes. And so again, that's Atlantic once again saying, we're going to kind of not interfere too much, and we're going to embrace some of the more complex sounds that are happening. Teddy Charles makes a couple of very innovative records at Atlantic early on. And Teddy's a great vibraphonist, West Coast, who is, again, kind of a compositionally driven, bigger arrangements, movements and sounds that are happening that verge on hints of the avant-garde. Warren Marsh, fantastic saxophonist. He makes some great records along with Lee Konitz. Again, it's just kind of, and then of course Jimmy Joffrey. Jimmy Joffrey is one of the leading proponents on the West Coast of dissonance and complex chords and sounds that you don't really think of. And of course, Capitol gives him his first two recordings, but he moves to Atlantic shortly after that. He makes probably 6 records at Atlantic in the late 50s. And they're really interesting records. And so you see Atlantic Records is really at the center of a lot of very interesting, novel sounds. And I don't think they're really recognized for it. All the names I've listed, these are the cutting edges of sounds of jazz in the late 50s. And it's at Atlantic where this stuff is being done. And of course, you got Chris Conner, the great singer. Ray Charles is doing stuff on both the R&B 8000 and the 1200 sequence. So again, there's Bobby Short's doing some kind of more accessible stuff. You got some Wilbur de Paris, which has some New Orleans tradition going on. So there's just a real wide swath of sounds happening at Atlantic, like Bob Weinstock at Prestige, only Atlantic takes it one step further and really entertains the early sounds of the avant-garde and even free jazz. And again, some of Ornette Coleman's greatest works are here at Atlantic. A lot of John Coltrane's most innovative works are here at Atlantic. Atlantic was a big opening in Coltrane's mind. He'd kind of been working with, Miles Davis and got fired for drugs. He spent some time with Monk, and it's that time with Monk that leads him into his time at Atlantic. And Coltrane kind of leaps through some doors with Giant Steps and some of the other recordings he makes. And so the bottom line is Mingus is not alone here at Atlantic in terms of doing things that are unconventional and unexpected. And Pithecanthropus is just one of the pinnacles of what Atlantic's doing in the mid-50s, late 50s. It's really a great record that I was really into for years back in the mid-90s, early thousands, when I was doing all my avant-garde stuff, loving all that free jazz, spending hours immersed in, Kula Samama and Alm Ascension, all those Coltrane records, listening to Pharoah Saunders, Themby, Albert Eiler, Archie Shepp. I was listening to a lot of that stuff on a regular basis because, again, you come in through Miles and a Coltrane, and Coltrane and Impulse kind of spreads you into who his friends were at Impulse. And so it's very, again, kind of easy for a young rock and roll cat to start delving into all the avant-garde and the sounds of the psychedelic 60s in rock and jazz. There's crossover there. There's a familiarity there that I think someone who comes from psychedelic rock and Grateful Dead space jams and long fucking, you can relate to Pharoah Saunders' record quite easily. It kind of grafts itself quite naturally because the sound of the 60s has an overbearing arc on all the various genres. Motown delves into psychedelic. Temptations are doing things that are laced with that sound. It's kind of crossing all the genres. And jazz was obviously no exception. And the avant-garde, especially in this era, is usually quite accessible. It's usually hinted at and not living there. We might go into a doorway and spend a little time in this house, but we're going to go back to the rest of the block and see what else is going on. And again, Mingus, what a difficult person. He truly was. From pulling guns on people to breaking people's jaws to getting fired by Ellington. The stories tell themselves in a lot of ways. And I think in some ways he's been a little bit ignored by some of the critics because of his personality flaws. But by the same token, he's more popular in some jazz circles than a lot of his contemporaries who probably deserve more credit. Bill Jackson is a bigger name and a bigger star in jazz in the 1950s and 60s than Mingus was. Mingus was kind of a peripheral guy. He was a bass player on the West Coast, working with Red Norville, the vibraphonist. He's doing stuff at Sadway with these composer series, but he's always been kind of a peripheral, a fine session guy. But he's certainly not seen in that period as one of the leading voices of the movement like he is by a lot of the avant-garde people today. And so his records do fetch pretty good money nowadays, but it's an interesting story and one that's hard to get a thumb on, and I think you're going to get into Mingus early on. If you come from rock and roll, he'll make sense. He's always got the blues and the black church in his sound, but like I said, he's not afraid to express a lot of his anger, which is what it is. He's a very unpleasant guy, and he's not happy with his role in America, how white America treats Black America. He's got a lot of issues with the social programs that are in place, the social norms, as you could say. But like all of us, we fight through that stuff. and we try to find our place within that mix. Some of us do it better than others, but Mingus's role in jazz is a very important one, and he's a great barometer, and he's an interesting way for us to hear those train tracks as they delve into some of that weird territory. It's a pretty good place to get a feel for it. I think Ornette Coleman's a bit over the edge too quickly for a younger jazz fan. You know, Giant Steps is fairly accessible for the numbers game that it kind of is, but a lot of Mingus stuff, again, a lot of us come from a background where we've been watching film our whole life. And so to have dissonance in a horror soundtrack or in a suspense film, a lot of those moods that he creates will be familiar to us from just watching films and the film soundtracks that we've been exposed to a lot of our adult lives. Mingus was touching on that stuff and creating those pastels and sounds and scapes through his jazz band as early as 1955 and 56, which again is really an impressive thing, and Atlantic deserves all the credit in the world. I was just in the mood to talk about this record. It's a cool record. I've listened to it, and I've had the Mingus Atlantic box set for years on CD, so I became pretty familiar with his Atlantic work, The Clown, Blues and Roots. It's really good. Tonight at Noon, some good stuff. He's such an interesting cross section, and he represents a lot of the changes happening in jazz just in himself alone. He's a microcosm of all that convolution. And Mingus, from one record to the next, could go from something quite undigestible to something very palatable. And of course, he launches that little label, Candid, debut. I think he's what he launched to help record, young musicians who weren't getting the chance to record their own music. And somehow he ends up selling that to Fantasy. I think he was dating one of the daughters of one of the owners of Fantasy, one of the Weiss brothers' daughters, if I remember. And I think he gives it to her as a wedding present. And then, of course, Fantasy ends up reissuing a lot of that debut stuff, which Mingus has some interesting recordings on there. But again, Mingus is an interesting cat. He's tough to get a grip on. And a good place to come into Mingus is right here, Pithecanthropus erectus. It'll give you a real interesting, broad swath of what he's about. And it's on par with his Columbia work, Aum. And his Impulse stuff is also very noteworthy and accessible. And it's more of the stuff on Candid and Debut that can be a little bit more out there. But it's all, again, a lot of it's who his sidemen were as well. And a lot of guys looked forward to working with Mingus in spite of the personal conflicts and difficulties. And some guys couldn't stand being around him and were gone within weeks of working for him. And like I said, he was fired from Ellington's group pretty quickly. It was never a personality that gelled well with a lot of mankind. Which, of course, makes him a bit of a Pithecanthropus erectus in his own self. A little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy right there. So anyway, that's today's episode. Just a quick little sampler episode. We'll get back to you with some content on probably Tuesday. I'll make something new. So y'all be safe. Have a great Sunday. We'll talk to you soon. Peace.